All right, welcome back. After starting with the weakest piece on the board, which was the pawn, we've reviewed how pawns moved in the last section. Now we're going to move on to the second weakest piece on the board, which is by a very small margin, the knights. They are only slightly weaker than the bishop, and in general, a knight for a bishop trade usually is very close to equal. So, these are the knights, as we recall. They're the ones that look like horses. They are not horses. They are knights. And they're the trickiest pieces to learn how to move because they are the only piece in chess that can jump over another piece. So the way the knight moves is in an L shape that goes 2 and then 1. So for example, this knight on g1 is allowed to move 2 squares in any direction and then 1 square in the other. So here, for example, this knight can go up 2 squares and then to the right like that. That would be the move nh3, as we can see from the notation here. Similarly, this knight can move up 2 squares and to the left. This would be knight f3, moving in the shape of an L, similar to knight h3. This knight cannot move 2 squares in one direction and then 1 square in the same direction. The computer will not let me make the move knight to g4 because this is not a legal move. It's not going to let me make it. So, knights being able to jump over pieces makes them a very useful piece and a somewhat harder one to restrict, and one that has to be restricted in different ways than other pieces might be. You'll note that these are the only 2 squares that white's knight can go to, h3 and f3, because the only other way it could try to go 2 and 1 would be to go knight 2 squares up and over 1, and we cannot go to this square because white's pawn is occupying it and we cannot take our own pawn. So for example here, if white were to start with the move e4, which as we know is a move that we can play because pawns can move 2 squares forward, now all of a sudden this knight can move to any of h3, as we can see this would be up 2 and then 1 like that. It can go to f3, so we can see up 2 and then 1, or it can even go to e2, over 2 and up 1. It's 2 squares in any direction, and then 1 square in another direction, all in straight lines. So, knights can move backwards, unlike pawns. Pawns can only move forward, so this pawn will never return to those squares. That's not going to happen. But a knight can. So, for example, if black were to play the move knight c6, as you can see, that's a legal move. 2 squares up, 1 square over. Here, white could also go 2 squares up, 1 square over, knight to f3. And if black really regretted his first move, this next move will be a big mistake because he's bringing his knight towards the center. But this knight, in theory, could go all the way back home. He can go 2 squares back and 1 square to the left. So it's always in an L shape, always 2 and then 1. It's not 3 and then 1. This knight cannot go 3 squares over and 1 square up. The computer won't let me do it. But it could go 2 and then 1. Knights tend to be happiest in the center of the board. Really, almost all pieces tend to be happiest in the center of the board, but knights particularly so because they are a short-range piece. So if we think about, for example, in this position after e4, knight c6, this knight here on g1 only has 3 squares that it can go to. It can go to h3, to f3, or to e2. If this knight goes to h3, so let's say we go here, knight h3. This knight is now on the side of the board, and once more, it can go to 3 squares. These are the 3 squares the knight can go to. It can go up 2, over 1. It cannot go up 2 and over 1 off the side of the board, of course. It can go over 2 and up 1 because f4 is not occupied. It cannot go over 2 and down 1 because f2 is occupied. And it could go back 2 and left 1 to come back home. As we can see, much like the g1 square, when this knight is on h3, it only has access to 3 other squares. But this knight on c6, which is much closer to the center, has access to significantly more squares. So it could go back to b8, that's 1, but it could also go 2, 3, 4, and 5. It's fighting for 5 squares here, and it sees 8 squares. Even if it can't, in theory, move to a7 or e7, it's controlling these squares. So this knight actually on c6 already controls its maximum number of 8 squares. It's eyeballing here, it's eyeballing here, eyeballing here, and here, and here, and here, and here, and here. So this knight on c6 is looking at all of these squares here. That is as active as a knight can get. The knight is reasonably close to the center of the board, and it's looking at 8 different squares, and it can go to 5 of them. This knight on h3, on the other hand, is eyeballing 4 different squares, and it can go to 3 of them. So it's very important in general that your knights usually are happier when they're closer to the center of the board. So, unlike pawns, knights capture exactly the same way that they move. So, if we recall pawns, if black were to play e5 here, white cannot play pawn takes pawn on e5 because pawns capture diagonally. But knights capture the exact same way, and that makes them a bit easier. So in this position after d4, this pawn is attacked not only by black's pawn, because pawns capture diagonally, but also by black's knight, because this knight can go 2 and then 1 and take this pawn exactly the same way it would move normally. So that's how knights move. Hopefully that helps you understand the pieces that look like a horse but are not a horse. Thanks very much, and I will see you for the next lesson.